Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Race Baig is Adjunct Assistant Professor of Social Work at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and a visiting researcher as Assistant Professor at UCD School of Social Policy, Social Work, and Social Justice. She specializes in the study of gender and race relations in transnational communities with a focus on women's empowerment in Muslim communities through women-centered, narrative-based approach in deconstruction of myth and stereotypes. Her publications include formal and informal social support systems of migrant domestic workers in the journal called American Behavioral Scientist, Everyday Multiculturalism in Union, Power Construction in Migrant Domestic Workers Unionism in Ethnic and Racial Studies, and The Power to Change, Muslim Women's Rights Movement and the Resistance Towards Gender-Based Violence in China, Journal of Social Work. Besides academic publications, she has published a number of stories. For instance, this book, Break the Barriers, Inside Stories of Ethnic Minority Muslim Girls in Hong Kong, and guidebook on honor-based violence for social service practitioners, which is forthcoming this year, as far as I understand. So without further ado, I will now hand over to you, Race. Dr. Baig will talk for roughly 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So as announced earlier, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. Now the virtual floor is yours, Race. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Niall. Yes, so it's my pleasure to be here today to talk about the new topic that me and my team are actually working on for quite some years already, particularly looking into, just like what has been introduced, how Muslim women and young girls in Hong Kong or transnational situations between different countries, they perceived gender and honor-based violence or different kinds of sensitive, we see it as sensitive issues in gender perspective. So how, from their perspective, they would position themselves as the Muslim women in these contexts and narratives. So for the book, before I begin, the book that now has been showing you, I would like to share with you as well. So I'm going to send out the link in the chat box so that throughout the talk, you can actually refer to the book, which I will be actually using quite some of the content in it. So hope you can get the link. And as now introduced, I was supposed to be in UCD doing my visiting, but because of some family situation, I have to get back to Hong Kong. So apologize for my background. It's actually a hotel background because I'm in quarantine right now. So Hong Kong has a very strict quarantine rule. So that's why I have to be in quarantine right now. But then without further ado, I would like to start off my talk today. And for today's talk, of course, it's organized in a university setting, and it is based on academic studies. But then I guess throughout my presentation and later on Q&A, and if we have time for other occasions for chat, I would like to position today's talk as more as a combination of as a researcher and as well as my practice background in human rights and women's rights activism as well. So from my experience as a human rights advocates or women's rights advocates, and as well as an academic, how these two roles help me to see Islam and gender perspective, and how we can put forward these discussions in a more, no matter it's a domestic setting or international setting as well. Right, so today's topic is saving Muslim women. So it's actually a question, do we need to save Muslim women? I guess suppose the largest topic these days is particularly, within these few months, we see the US troops, the UK troops has been withdrawn from Afghan, and the whole situation on the Taliban coming back and forth in Afghanistan, what would be the impact on women has been on top of a lot of media, no matter it's on social media, conventional media, news reports, you can see a lot of topic and discussion actually going on of what is happening in that part of the world. And with this extremism coming into force, what would be the impact on women's rights. So this debate or this agenda is actually has been up on top of the women's rights agenda 20 years ago when 9/11 happened. Bush administration actually proclaimed that the new wave of international terrorism and the war on terror, which I would say is the WOT, war on terror against Islamic terrorism, becomes a domestic rhetoric. So a lot of debates have started because of 9/11 and as well as how women are actually being positioned. Of course, at that time, when Bush was talking about we have to tackle or put forward counterterrorism strategy against extremism or radicalization on Islam, whether at that time is Taliban or right now, including ISIS as well. They have been focusing a lot on the term extremism. But then the question is, even though we see a lot of debates talking about Islamic extremism as a force or as an oppressive force, these debates actually go beyond just the scope of Islamic terrorism, because somehow we see it as being generalized and people on the ground pick up these narratives as well. So while a lot of NGOs, no matter women's group or UN, has been criticizing the counterterrorism strategy as a lack of gender perspective, these narratives has been flooding us every day. So particularly if you are not familiar with what's going on 20 years ago, right now, just take a look at the media right now. You can see, media has been focusing a lot on gender debates or gender issues, particularly focusing on Afghan women and their situation after the Taliban has been forced again. But then when we roll back to 20 years ago, when the Bush administration declared war on terror, immediately, actually, Laura Bush has come up and said, war on terror is not just purely a war on Islamic extremism. We are also actually fighting against terrorism, which is for the dignity of women as well. So women agenda has been highlighted in the counterterrorism strategy. And immediately, the State Department has also issued a report to elaborate the condition of women and children under the Taliban, particularly focusing on their access to education, their prevention and outside of work, their freedom, their access to health facilities, healthcare, and how their freedom are actually being confined as well. So all of these narratives and situations are actually put on top of the counterterrorism strategy. So after 20 years of these narratives being put forward, of course, on and off, we don't really see a lot of these debates going on, But then after 20 years of time, this year, when the force and the troops have withdrawn themselves, all of a sudden, Afghan women agenda has come up again. And you can see a lot of highlights. So just like what I'm focusing on these couple of media reports, you can see Afghan women are being restricted, they cannot go into school, schools are closed, and women are no longer being able to have their freedom of movement. And of course, to a lot of cases, we heard a lot of situations of women being killed because of their advocacy work, or even just because they wanted to go for schools or they wanted to go for work. So all these situations are being highlighted in the media. So after 20 years of time, media keep on highlighting the re-suppression. I say it's not just purely suppression of women under the Taliban. It's actually re-suppression because the Taliban came into force again. So it seems like there was 20 years of peaceful period or autonomy for women, but all of a sudden, the re-suppression came forward again. So the war on terror narrative on Muslim women being suppressed no longer serves its purpose in the international policy or politics on counterterrorism. But then somehow these narratives are actually being domesticated and constantly constructing the public perceptions towards Muslim women. So later on, I'll be actually focusing, my presentation will be focusing on the second half of this situation, is how these narratives even though we perceive it as the discourse being used in security, but somehow they are being domesticated. And we can see they're exercising in our day-to-day living. And particularly when we talk about everyday racism, no matter in which countries, so later on I'll be using more Hong Kong and Pakistan, these two countries, these two places as an example to look into how these narratives are being domesticated, and as well as what would be the impact on our understanding towards Muslim women's situations. But the first question we have to go forward is, why after 20 years of time, these narratives are still there? What have been changed? Are there really any changes being made in this 20 years of time? How come we can see the same narratives are actually going on? So if we see there should be some kind of progress, what are these progress? And if there is no progress, what went wrong? Can we try to dig into the problem or the situation of why such kind of narratives are being sustained in the international agenda, and what is their impact on people on the ground when they are experiencing the interaction among different stakeholders who are using or reinforcing these narratives on them. So as a researcher, I do have some sort of reflection on this issues or context, because 20 years ago was actually my year one, my first year in the university. So it was a very vivid experience that you look at news of what happened on 9/11. It just shocked you at that time. And people start to talk about it. Of course, we were in Hong Kong. We didn't really experience terrorist attack as such, but every day we are receiving informations, receiving reports, no matter international news or not, we absorb these informations and narrative. So throughout my studies and after my graduation, when I first started to work, I engaged in human rights work. I've been working like 10 years in human rights field and women's rights field, particularly focusing on minority women. So I would start to think, after all these years of work, at the very first beginning, I do agree a lot with these narratives, particularly when we have the package of women's being suppressed under Taliban, and how they are being suppressed, why they are being suppressed. The religious context or the religion, the Islam itself, has been put on table quite a lot and quite strong. So without any further elaboration or consideration, somehow it's very easy for us to take the narrative because it's so dominated in the media, and you just take it as it is, seeing that as from a women's rights perspective, we need to protect Muslim women. We need to save them from these oppressions. So the rescuing, the protection, all these discourse and these terms are actually very vivid in our advocacy work, how we can rescue them, how we can protect them. So it's actually dominating by the whole discourse on rescuing women. And it's not just purely from the state itself, not just purely from the US or US States Department, how they put forward the narrative. Somehow these narratives are being localized and being used by NGOs, by frontline activists. So just like a report by Human Rights Watch in 2001, we can see that the women's rights perspective or this agenda is actually tied closely with the security issue. How the Taliban's crime in Afghanistan are actually linked to women's suppression. And this link not just purely maintained in Afghanistan, but it can be actually generalized to larger Muslim community as well. So Afghan women has been put in brutal civil war, and on top of that, their rights are being denied, their fundamental rights, freedom are actually being denied. Now, as conflict intensifies with the US-led war against terrorism, Afghan women are actually suffering more and deprived from their rights as well. So it's been highlighted in not just such kind of narrative is not just purely in Human Rights Watch report, but you can see it in the UN report, in other human rights group, Amnesty International. Same context is actually being put forward. So, of course, for the US, I guess from Bush administration, he was very clear. He seems to be very clear that he was focusing on Islamic terrorism or extremism, particularly with a focus on Taliban. But then when you look into the content analysis or the narratives, somehow I did a certain, discourse analysis on how Bush has put forward this narrative. He, on one hand, seems to be very clearly saying that we are targeting Islamic extremism. But then this narrative has been quite dominating in his speech. Rather, you can seldomly hear him saying that, Islam is he did say, Islam is a peaceful religion. So we are on the side with those Muslims who support, peace and support our actions. So it actually differentiates us and them. Us will be those who support the US war on terror. So no matter you are Muslim, no matter you are of other religion, as long as you support our war on terror, you will be us. Them will be the others, particularly those Muslims who are not on the side of the US. So the us versus them rhetoric is actually very clear. It's so clear-cut that generalizing Muslim as a whole, that is them instead of us. So after 9/11, Bush has put forward that narrative. And in the UK, actually Tony Blair at that time, he also keep saying similar kind of narrative as well. It is a war, if you like, between the civilized and the uncivilized. So such kind of us versus them rhetoric is actually very much stems from the Orientalist discourse, which is put forward by Edward Said. Civilized West versus barbaric East. So in Edward Said's Orientalism, we can see that the world is actually differentiated into the Occident and the Orient. The Orient are the barbaric East, whether the Occident is the civilized, democratized West, and they have to put forward their civilization in order to liberate people or to save people from the barbaric East, the Orient. So we can see from the whole narrative on war on terror is actually surrounding the whole Orientalist discourse. And under the Orientalism, Muslim women of the Orient, so of course from the East, they are under the oppression by the uncivilized Muslim women. So therefore they need to be rescued by the civilized West. So that is somehow the whole picture of how Edward Said has been putting forward of Orientalism, and such kind of framework actually matches with the war on terror, the whole strategy, and itself the discourse as well. But then it didn't just stop there. It's mainly from the state perspective. How if we need to invade Afghanistan, so we need to save the women over there. So that is from the state perspective. But then besides from the state perspective, we can actually see that these narratives or these beliefs are actually intrinsically being exercised by a lot of NGOs, by a lot of frontline practitioners, particularly by women's rights activists or advocates as well. So Payton has been actually coining these kind of practices as Orientalist feminism, featuring 3 different kinds of characteristics. One is actually uncivilized, the East is actually uncivilized and the worst place for women. Muslim women are all under the oppression of men and they need to be rescued and they do not have any agency at all. So of course, I'm trying to very briefly talk about how she coined Orientalist feminism. But then the same narratives actually put forward is is the rescue. The rescue part is actually the main part. And somehow she also highlighted the lack of agency. And they are no idea of, or they could not be empowered themselves. So that's why they need to be waited passively to be saved or being rescued. So for this discourse, of course, we are trying to see if it's so dominating in the international perspective, what would be the impact on the local perspective and how they are being played out on the ground practices as well. So somehow we can see there are two levels of domesticating these narratives into on the ground practices. The first one is when, from the US perspective, when just like the Bush administrations or the other states, they are highlighting Muslim extremism as the dominant discourse in their an explanation of the whole war on terror, such that narrative has been dominating the whole discussion on how Islam it is. And the domination actually have made people so easy to take it up or to pick it up on the ground, particularly for people who do not have a lot of idea of what Islam is about. If they do not have a lot of ideas on Islam, they are actually very easy to take up this narrative and explanation and generalizing towards the whole Muslim community, as even though they're talking about extremism, but it's actually just generalized to the general Muslim community. So we can see one phenomenon is how people are actually using the narrative because of the lack of understanding towards Islam, and they are using it in their race relations with Muslim and other minority groups in their country. And on the other hand, that we can see from the UK perspective, because of course 9/11, we are talking about international terrorist attack, but there are also homegrown terrorist attacks and terrorism being found in the country, particularly in UK, because I'm using UK as a reference point because Hong Kong was the colony of the United Kingdom. So later on, I will explain a little bit of what do we mean by post-colonial pattern of such kind of narrative being domesticated in Hong Kong as well. So after their homegrown terrorist attack, the UK government have been domesticated the counter-terrorist strategy on the ground race relations building and reconstruction. So such kind of reconstruction on race relations, particularly on how the idea of security is put forward on your day-to-day living about terrorist attack, terrorism, and how you perceive your neighbor who could be a Muslim and how you should develop your relationship with him is actually put a lot of tense and stress towards people. And it differentiates, particularly going back to the us versus them rhetoric. You actually put a lot of stress that, whites, British are different from the brown British who are the Muslims, and them, they are related to terrorism. So such kind of domestication are actually being more and more frequent, particularly when we look into the case of Shamima Begum, how the NGOs on one hand try to rescue the girl who joined ISIS and try to get back to UK, the whole case of Shamima Begum. You can see those who are on the side of child protections, women's rights protections, they are also talking about we have to rescue Shamima Begum and the babies, and they do need our protection. So on one hand, from the first point, we see a strong Orientalist narrative being domesticated. And the second point, from the case of women, homegrown Muslim women joining terrorist attack and the aftermath, also put forward the Orientalist feminism narrative, saying that Muslim women need to be saved by the women's advocates or by the women's activists as well. So the whole debates go on to how these narratives are being domesticated and what would be the impact. So that would be the larger picture of the framework. But then when we are trying to look into the Hong Kong experience, somehow we're also looking into how these narratives are being transported, or from the Hong Kong perspective, are being imported to local practices. So as I mentioned, Hong Kong has been a British colony for more than 150 years, around 150 years, and Hanover was in 1997. But then we can see the minority population is actually very similar to the UK composition of minority because of the colonial or post-colonial movement. That's Muslims in Hong Kong are mainly brought by the British administration in the colonial rule, and then they are, staying behind in Hong Kong and settle in Hong Kong. So many of these Muslim, I would say, communities are actually from other colonies of the UK as well, including Pakistan, India, or other Southeast countries, Southeast nations. So the migration pattern of post-colonial movement are actually very similar or resembles what is the minority population in the UK. But then they have a very strong segregation with the local community. On one hand, maybe because of language, or on the other hand, because the minorities coming in Hong Kong, they are mainly through the connections with the colonial government, the UK government. So with the local community, they are actually very segregated and they don't really need to interact a lot. So before 1997, we see a very strong segregation between, minority communities, mainly from India and Pakistan, and the local Chinese community. With the segregation, the interaction is minimal and the understanding towards each other are minimal as well. And on the other hand, race relations policy, legislations, because of our legal system and legal structure, our policy structures are actually very much lingered from the colonial rule. So a lot of these practices on policy or the legal system actually resembles the UK policy and legislation. So my PhD was actually looking, way back a long time ago. It was looking into the legislation on race relations in Hong Kong. And what we found is actually Hong Kong piece of legislation actually mirrored the piece of legislation in the UK. So you can see it's the content, the protection clauses, the scope of discussions or debates inside the legislation are actually very much resemble the UK situation. Of course, because of the pattern of migration are very similar. So I wouldn't say it's irrelevant, but then because of the segregation as well, a lot of local debates or a lot of local situation may not be sufficiently being put forward in the policy or legislation level. So because of such understanding or limited understanding, we do not have a lot of idea of what's going on in the Muslim community, but then we are being sublimated in the idea that Muslim women, no matter where you are, but as long as you are Muslim women, you will be subject to suppression of Islam practices or Islamic practices. So a couple of years ago, me and my team started to work with a local NGO on domestic violence. It was the time when we received more and more cases from the NGO saying that they started to receive cases from minority women, particularly from Muslim women, questioning or reporting cases of domestic violence. But because of what I've mentioned, the long-term segregation, they don't really have a lot of idea of how Muslim women are experiencing domestic violence in Hong Kong. So a couple of years ago, we started the research on understanding or exploring Muslim women understanding on gender-based violence. So how do they perceive domestic violence? How do they understand child abuse? All these situations, what do these situations and concepts meant to them? So from that study, it was the first phase, I would say, the whole package of the research project. We found that they actually have understanding and idea, very strong understanding and ideas of these concepts, but then they may not use the exact term that we are using in the human rights framework. So when we try to ask them what do they mean by gender-based violence, they may not be able to answer you what gender-based violence is, but then they will be able to use their own words to explain violence, to explain the relationship between men and women, to explain the power relationship between the men and women, and how violence or violations could be found because of this power relationship. So, and when we go into deeper, more specific terms within the gender-based violence framework, how would they perceive, domestic violence? How would they perceive their relationship with their husband? They can actually tell you very vivid experience that they have been experiencing, and they are objecting those abusive experiences as well. So from then on, you can actually see these terms or these concepts are actually embedded in them, but they may not use the same narrative or the same terms as we are using in the human rights framework. So from that first phase of research, we then start the second and the third phase. The second would be exploring younger women, their perspective on gender as a whole. So no matter how they see relationship building, marriage, how they understand their body autonomy, all these kinds of concepts. So we try to explore the understanding with them, what these concepts means to them. And the first phase is we try to look into deeper experiences of honor-based violence. Particularly from the second phase, we actually heard that a lot of girls, they have experienced honor-based violence, particularly forced marriage. So what do these experiences tell them about? How do they make sense of it? Is it the same as how the international discourse has portrayed that they are being suppressed in this forced marriage and honor-based violence, and they need to be rescued? So the book actually, the link that I've sent you in the chat box is actually some of the stories they have written from the second phase of the research that they started to think about what these situations meant to them. So interestingly, we try to explore how these ideas and concepts meant to them, and do these ideas matches with the mainstream discourse on war on terror, particularly highlighting women's oppressions under Islamic extremism. So couple of findings I would like to share today is actually, of course, we can discuss more later in the Q&A sections. One thing we hear a lot is about when the mainstream discourse is saying that they need to be rescued, they need to be protected. And from the Orientalist feminism framework, we can see or highlighting Muslim women are being lack of agency. One thing we wanted to explore is how do they see their agency? Do they have or do they own their own agency? One thing we discovered is it's actually a journey for them. We have interviewed around 20 girls, a qualitative study. So we try to explore all these experiences, how they make sense of it, how Islam makes sense to them as well, and as well as how the general public put the identity on them. So one thing is we found is actually quite an exploratory journey for them. Some or a little bit of my own sharing before going to the interviews content is I did actually have such kind of exploration as well as my own. So when I was studying and then heard about the 9/11 situation and go into the human rights work, I absorbed that narrative. I tried to think about what this narrative meant to me as a Muslim woman. How do I make sense of it? Am I being oppressed? Is my religion oppressing me? Is it hindering my freedom? And so on and so forth. And when I was working in a human rights organization, so I was talking with other minority rights activists as well. So when we started to work on women's rights issues or education, because there was an NGO who focused a lot of work on women's education, minority women's education. And I was talking with some of the activists that And just some personal sharing at that time. I was like, not really. I didn't really being forced to get married by my parents. I don't really experience any kind of restriction on my education and freedom, so on and so forth. And then one of the activists suddenly say, "Oh, you are different. You are not regarded as minority women as such, So you're different. You're just different." I was actually a bit shocked at that time. Why I'm different? I am a Muslim. Why my Muslim identity has to be, judged by you, judged by someone else, but not by myself, that I can uphold my Muslim identity. Rather, someone is telling me whether I am Muslim or not. So that was actually some kind of shock to me at that time. And such kind of self-discovery journey, somehow I found in our interviewees as well. One story is, Sarah has been mentioned. So all these stories and quotes that I'm going to mention to you are, of course, the name are pseudonyms. So you can't identify them from the name, but we get the consent of, telling their stories and telling their narratives. So from Sarah's story, we can see that, Sarah was a girl, around 20 years old, and she was, telling about her experience. At that time, she was studying in secondary school. A couple of years ago, she was studying in secondary school, and somehow she get into some stressful situation in school, and then her father was yelling at him and scolding her, and she was so scared that she didn't want to go back home at that night. She just didn't want to face her father. So she called up the police and called up the shelter. So she went back to a shelter and stayed there for a night. And after the incident, she had to return home because the police told her that if you don't return home, I may have to sue your father. Do you really want to sue your father? So she was so scared that no, I better go back home. So when she got back home, she was granted for 4 months. And within that 4 months, she was actually thinking a lot about herself. Did I do anything wrong? I may deserve this, confinement by my father being granted because I wasn't a good girl. I was trying to report my father to the police, how bad daughter I was. So I deserve for such kind of punishment. I deserve to be confined. I deserve to have my freedom being restricted. So after a couple of months of being granted, and then her family sent her back to Pakistan because try to get her to get married, and she struggled, and then luckily it was her sister's marriage, so she can actually get rid of a lot of confrontations with the family. Particularly, she know that because she went against his father on the proposal on the forced marriage, so she may be actually facing honor killing. She was actually expecting honor killing, but luckily because of her sister's marriage, so the honor killing was put aside, and her situation was being put aside by the family. So when she got back to Hong Kong, her family told her to restore her honor. So instead of getting married, she tried to step by step to rebuild the understanding with the family and the parents particularly. She go for further education to prove that she can actually being studied well and get a good job, get a good position in the society, being honored, being respected by the Muslim community in Hong Kong. So she is actually trying out a lot of different methods in order to gain what her parents meant by honor to them, instead of going directly to her parents' will of getting married and just leave the family. She tried to use her own method to restore that honor. So speaking for myself was not easy, that Sarah said. But somehow with this battle with my parents, I slowly understand how to rebuild this trust and this honor, parents' idea of honor, to how to rebuild that with them, and how I try to understand my parents as well. They were brought up in a very different environment from my environment of bringing up. They handle their situations differently from how I perceive them. I know they are forgiving me in their own way. So instead of I have to be so-called being seen as being oppressed and forced into a forced marriage, you can see that Sarah is actually trying to use her way, to use some of the capacity that she has to reframe the whole situation, so that step by step he can actually go out of this being oppressed situation. So, and her throughout the journey, I will show them my capacity or capability in doing many things. So instead of I have to fall into their perceptions of honor and religious righteousness, I will use my own way to demonstrate to them how this religious righteousness could be being put forward in another way, another acceptable way. So there are lots of communications, negotiations with the parents, and somehow from Sarah's experience, she did that. And Hina's experience also told us a little bit about how the religious journey actually quite similar to Sarah's experiences. The situation of how people talk about religion. So to her, talking about religion, we have to look into what exactly religion is about, but not using the term religion to abuse the other. Hina has been using the term spiritual abuse quite a lot in her reflection in this piece. You can actually find this piece in that book. To say that a predominant addition to gender-based violence is that men in patriarchal society control women and ensure obedience via religious propaganda. For example, forced marriage by parents are popular as children are suppressed to listen and respect their parents. The situation, of course, can happen the other way around, when women may also abuse men by citing religious rights and responsibility. For instance, a man ought to be a breadwinner of the family. These rigid cultural norms often lead to a lot of doubting of the victims of spiritual abuse, because they may hold religion responsible for being draconian, instead of realizing the manipulation and distorted forces or enforced by the people of authority. So Hina, in her reflection of how religion should be being put in the discourse of gender-based violence, she can actually differentiate the narrative from the authority and how people are being used on the ground, and whether the usage on the ground are actually a kind of abuse or is actually linked up or have any kind of religious ground. So if not, how we can differentiate these two practices on top level and the bottom level. Another point we can see apart from a journey meaning that it's a kind of development. You may not expect Muslim women in the first place that, or young girls in our cases, they may not in the first place have such kind of idea of what these concepts and ideas means to them. But then throughout the journey on their own, on their exploration, you can see they slowly acquire their own understanding, no matter through exploring religion or through exploring their own experience. Another type of experience that they explore would be the transnational experience. So just like the case of Sarah that I've mentioned, it is a pure or very common case of transnational movement, which relate to honor-based violence. So just like in Hong Kong, they may not experience direct forced marriage or honor killing. But then a lot of families, we can see from cases that these girls are sent back to their home country. So just like in Pakistan, where these abuses happened. So there is a very strong transnational tie in these kind of abusive situation. So just like when we are looking into the honor-based violence phenomenon between the home country and Hong Kong, Muslim young women actually develop their own understanding because of this transnational movement. What is the differences between the situation back in their home country versus the situation in Hong Kong? Tells them that because of the situational differences, how they cope with the situation or how they develop the capacity to cope with these situations could be very different. And they acquire the knowledge of how we differentiate these two places so that they know what exactly are the capacity they need in order to help them escape these situations. So just like Rabia has been mentioning, it depends on the extent that she has damage to the family. So if she is talking to someone that the family is very straight, she may not be able to talk to that person anymore. And she may be just being limited by her freedom to talk to anyone, isolating her or even marrying her out, making sure that she has no way to get back to courting. So that's how she portrayed if the situation happened in Pakistan. So, but then in Hong Kong, I don't really hear a lot about these experiences. So honor is too big. Honor is a big thing, but I don't really hear these practices are being exercised in Hong Kong. Probably it's just only restricting their freedom, stopping from the educations, but then, honor killing or forced marriage are not really happening in Hong Kong. So I heard about these cases of girls seeing their boyfriend, and their families are really, really serious about that and wanted to stop them from seeing their boyfriend. But then all these kinds of forced marriage, just like the case of Sarah, is not being happened in Hong Kong. So what Rabia has been talking about, the differentiation between same kind of honor-based violence, but how it could be exercised by the family could be quite different upon or depending on where the family is situated. So just like the story of Sam's story actually also show a strong capacity building through this transnational movement. So on one hand, she was having a boyfriend in Hong Kong, and that's why her family found out, and her family would like her to just marry out so that she no longer could see her boyfriend in Hong Kong. So she was sent back to Pakistan and forced to marry her cousin. But then Sam herself is actually a community worker in Hong Kong. So she got quite a lot of ideas and knowledge on what the social system is about in Hong Kong, how to find a social worker, how she can link up with a social worker, how to find a lawyer. So her capacity is actually quite strong in Hong Kong. But then once she was being sent back to Pakistan, all this knowledge and linkage in Pakistan could be different from her knowledge in Hong Kong. But then because of, she still got that ties, connections with Hong Kong social workers. So she actually contacted the social worker in Hong Kong, and the social worker in Hong Kong tried to help her out through these transnational organizations that find a lawyer for her, because she was actually confined in the family after marriage, and because it was forced marriage, and her passport and all these documents are being held up. So Sam was actually able to find out how, in what way, in her own capacity, that she can escape from these situations instead of being suppressively being sitting in Pakistan and experience all those violations and abuses. She had her own way and capacity to make her way out of the situation. So for her, similar to what Hina and Sarah has been mentioning, that we, as a girl, we desire for freedom in my heart so strong that nothing can stop me. Girls, get up and fight for yourself. This is how we should do for our life. So you can see a strong agency in her case as well, and how she developed such kind of capacity. The third important point we found from these cases is the religion discourse. The religious discourse on women's rights is actually very strong. But then instead of, in line with the war on terror discourse on Muslim women being suppressed and how religion extremism has been oppressing women, we can see through our interviews with these girls. These girls are actually trying to reclaim religious discourse on women's rights. So just like what Maria has been telling us, they can't just say their own understanding if they don't go through the scriptures and the versions that is actually written. So what the religions say is we do need to go back to the context and the scripture itself the scripture, even though she, I didn't quote it here, even though, they think a guy can have 4 wives, but then there are lots of limitations and conditions. It's not like a general cause that a Muslim man can have 4 wives, but then there are lots of contextual consideration, particularly when these clauses are being put forward in scripture, why they were put in such a way, and what are the other limitations and considerations if these clauses are being put in practices. So you cannot just generalize all these kind of scriptures without looking into the context. And Lena has been talking about how religion are actually being played out in different kinds of professions. If we are just looking into religion without understanding it, without having a closer look to be educated on their religion, all these religions, rules and regulations are being abused. So Lena herself is a social worker from a Pakistani background. I also heard a lot of local social workers saying that they're like, oh, but then a lot of time is because of their culture and religion. So that's why they may be experiencing like forced marriage or abuses or even marital rape. So it's a kind of culture or religion that these women are experiencing. So we can't help them, but then somehow we need to respect these kind of religious practices. So Lena was in the interview, she was actually quite furious about, these kind of experiences, why you are using the term cultural sensitivity or religious sensitivity, but don't really look into whether the religion allows these abuses or not. Why you don't try to understand as a profession, why you don't try to understand from a religious perspective, are these practices legitimate? So from Isma's experience as well, Isma was talking about, I actually have lots of realization. So just like if I'm being a woman, being unjustly treated, I feel so angry, I feel so furious. I have asked these questions a lot. Why women are being abused, why they are being treated as such. But somehow a lot of old people or elder peoples and their responses never seems to satisfy me. So I look it up into the Quran by myself. I try to ask God why women are experiencing these kind of abuses and sufferings. I find answers from none but Allah. And doing so, I learned that all these sufferings, as we Muslim, especially my fellow Muslim sisters, fostered were not due to Islam, but rather because of the stereotype constructed by the least knowledgeable people. So her reflection on how religion are actually being portrayed, how the incorrectness are being put forward, actually constructed the understanding and the knowledge of sufferings, and whether or not we should go back into the religion discourse to look into whether these abuses and violations are acceptable or legitimate in the religious context. So from these experiences and narratives being put forward by these girls, I guess somehow as a quick conclusion is we recognize the transformation of Muslim women. So rather than we are seeing that within 20 years of time, the war on terror narrative never been changed, we can see a lot of changes and regaining of agency by Muslim women on the ground. They are not static. They are not passive recipients of help and rescue, but then they are person of agency. They are trying to build their own capacity and reclaiming these kind of narratives and to give them the identity that they want. So rather than looking at from a top-down rescue approach, can we actually build up a bottom-up capacity building approach in order to change the Muslim women's situation and abuses? Try to look into their construction of agency, their construction of their own situations, and what would be the best way in order to change, in order to build their capacity through their knowledge and understanding. So I guess that I will stop here for my presentation and exploration, and I will pass time to you now to see if we can have any further kinds of discussions.
Thank you so much, Rais, and wonderful, very fascinating talk, looking at the global level to down to national, national, local, and then family and personal stories. So I would like to just ask, there are two questions, and I think the time is going up, sort of ending, but hopefully you can stay on. It's already quite late for you, Rais, but so I'd like to just start off asking a very basic question. Like, I read your book and stories of Maya and Saya. Like, I want to understand a little bit more about women's or girls' access to education. Are there any Muslims girls kind of access to education and also to employment? Are they any way restricted, or are they kind of influenced by single-sex education, like being the norm and so on and so forth? So that's one very quick question. And there are two questions coming from our colleague, Dr. Nirahari. So I would read out to you. As the young people developed their sense of agency, to what extent was their faith religion impacted? Did they tend to lose their faith, or did that remain important to them as they reconstructed their identity? That's the first question. And if there is time for, what are the lessons for social workers and other professionals working with young Muslim women? Thank you.
Right. For the first one on education and work, I think, of course, it's hard to say, because education is supposed to be compulsory, I would say. So technically, they need to attend education. But then we also see a lot of cases that they may need to get married in early age. So instead of formally stopping education, they may be, because of this transnational movement, they may get back to home country for marriage. And when they leave Hong Kong, then there is no guarantee whether the family will send them back for further education. So there is kind of struggle over there, I would say. But I would say these cases, when you get more and more these cases and you recognize it, and I guess from parents' educations, what the organizations are doing, we're trying to tackle how to ensure, even though there may be certain kind of practices, but then we still retain women at work and education as well. So I guess that's the on one hand, we have to look into the agency of the girls and on their understanding on what education means to them. Instead of just purely we tell them that you need to be educated, we have to ensure the girls themselves, they wanted to get education. So I guess that's the approach that we're doing. Yeah, and on Miriam's questions, I guess I didn't see them leaving the religion. But on the other hand, I see them trying to use their understanding to reconstruct their knowledge on the religion. So they tell us a lot about how when they were young, they are educated in a certain way, but then because of their experience, they would look into the religion again by themselves and make new interpretation of the religion. So rather than seeing the religion as a very rigid scripture, they will use their experience to reinterpret their religion and how to make sense of it. So I guess so that's why there is also a kind of fluidity of religion as well. It's not just purely Islam is only a model or the whole framework itself.
And the last question, if you about what are the lessons for social workers and other professions working with young Muslim women?
Yeah, so I guess that's quite similar to the conclusion. So because as social workers, particularly because a lot of social workers, if they are not from the minority background, they may not have a lot of knowledge, I would say. And they are actually quite scared about highlighting the fluidity of religion as well. So the mainstream discourse would be somehow being taken as the dominant practice. So just like the war on terror, the whole framework are actually being used by a lot of NGOs, saying that women are being oppressed by Islam practices or religion as a whole, rather than seeing or reinterpreting Islam, just like what the girls they are doing. They are actually reinterpreting the religion because they have the capacity to do so. They know how to go back into the scripture. But then as a social worker, particularly you are not from this religion, you are quite skeptical to make such kind of interpretation. You don't know really whether you are offending the other religions. So that's the what Hina's point was about. You know, as a profession, you need to look into the religion itself, rather than you are, you know, just listening to the mainstream dominant discourse, which may not be correct in certain way. So I guess, suppose as a social worker, we often need to go back into our clients. What do the religion and culture means to them, and how from their own experience they wanted to get different kinds of capacity building, instead of we see them as passive agents that you need certain kind of help and support from our own perspective. But then it should be going back to the girls' perspective.
Great, thank you so much, Race. I guess we should stop here as the time is up. So thank you again, Race, and I'd also like to thank everybody for joining us, and